So good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second webinar in the Whole Farm Plan series, where we will cover biodiversity audits and integrated pest management plans. I am Mary Douglas, and I will be your chair this evening, and I will introduce the speakers shortly. But first of all, we'll cover the housekeeping of Zoom. So we would welcome your questions on this topic, and questions can be submitted throughout the webinar. And if you use the Q&A function for that, so typically this will display in a black toolbar somewhere on your Zoom. If you're on more of a laptop or a tablet, it's quite often down near the bottom of the screen, but if you're on a smaller device like a phone, it may be somewhere else. But if you'll just go for a wee look at the moment to familiarise yourself with where the Q&A button is, and that's how you can submit your questions as we're going throughout tonight's webinar. Your questions will be seen by the organisers and speakers, and what we'll do is we'll manage those questions so that if a question comes in that's then later covered, or we know is going to be later covered, we'll manage those and then we'll put any outstanding to the speakers in the Q&A session. If you need to contact us directly, you can use the chat function and you can adjust that toggle just to send to the meeting host, and that'll come directly to us. So this webinar is being recorded. You possibly got an automated announcement of that as you joined. Don't worry, however, we're on a webinar, so it means we can't see your pictures or your faces. We're basically recording the content of this webinar so that either yourselves can catch up at a later date or others who are not able to join us tonight. Sorry, got too busy chatting. I forgot to show you the picture of the Q&A of what you're looking for there. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the second webinar in a three-part series. So the first webinar covered the guidance and the sort of concept of whole farm plans overall, and now we're breaking down into certain elements of the whole farm plan. So if you've missed that or you would like to go back to it, then there is a recording available, and I will send the YouTube link that's on the slide there. I'll also put that into the chat once we're underway so that you can take a copy of it from there if you would like to catch up on it. So now on to tonight's webinar. So we are joined by Mary Jane, Lawrie and Fiona Burnett as our speakers this evening. So Mary Jane is an agricultural consultant with SAC based in the Edinburgh office with a specialism in biodiversity and conservation. So is very well placed to cover the topic of biodiversity audits tonight. And Dr. Fiona Burnett is our second speaker and is a Professor of Applied Plant Pathology and Head of Knowledge Exchange and Impact at SRUC. So her expertise covers most aspects of applied plant health, and she has a particular research interest in integrated pest management. So we look forward to hearing from Fiona later. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and I'll hand over to Mary Jane to get us started this evening. That's displaying perfectly. Thanks, Mary Jane.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for joining us this evening, everybody. As Mary said, my name is Mary Jane Lawrie. I'm an agriculture consultant based in the Edinburgh office, so we cover the Lothians and Peeblesshire, and my background is in conservation and biodiversity. I studied conservation biology at university and always wanted to work in agriculture, so this is an exciting time to be in agriculture because everyone's talking about biodiversity and conservation. So it's a great time for me to be getting out and about and seeing lots of different farms. I also oversee the Women in Agriculture groups for the Farm Advisory Service. So I run one myself in the Lothians, but we've got in-person groups across Scotland. So if you're interested in finding out more about those, do have a look at the FAS website. There we go. So I thought we'd start off by talking about what is biodiversity. So the WWF, not to be confused with the Wrestling Foundation, is the World Wildlife Foundation. Biodiversity is all the different kinds of life you'll find in one area, the variety of animals, plants, fungi, and even microorganisms like bacteria that make up our natural world. Each of these species and organisms work together in ecosystems like an intricate web to maintain balance and support life. So the key thing for me there is the variability amongst living organisms and how they interact with each other. This idea of a web is really important. And we've all, I'm sure, very aware of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and the interaction between the two. So a decline in biodiversity will exacerbate the climate crisis, and the climate crisis is exacerbating a decline in biodiversity. So as you know, from next year, all farmers will need to be considering how they're going to work towards the whole farm plan. As Mary said, we've covered the basics of what that is in the introduction website, in the introductory webinar, so you can go back and watch that if you're unfamiliar with that. But just as a reminder, all the information for the whole farm plan and what you'll need to do from next year is on the Rural Payments website. So that's ruralpayments.org, and you'll see on the right hand side of your screen there, it says agriculture support is changing, find out more. So all the whole farm plan information that I'll be going through tonight is on there if you would like to read through it in more detail after the webinar. So just as a summary for the whole farm plan, you will need to do 5 activities, and that will all be from 2028. But from next year, you will need to do 2: carbon audit, biodiversity audit, soil analysis, animal health and welfare plan, or integrated pest management plan. So tonight we're obviously covering the biodiversity audit and integrated pest management plan, but as an agriculture consultant, my advice to you for next year is to pick the 2 easiest for your business. So that might not be the biodiversity audit at this stage, and it might not be the integrated pest management plan. Think about ones that you've already got in place. But the biodiversity audit is quite a simple one to do, as I will explain. It's also one of the elements that will last for 5 years. So if you do your biodiversity plan now, it will last for the next 5 years. So it might be quite a good one to get done early on so you can understand what to do. Carbon audit and soil analysis are similar. They both last for 5 years from the time that you've done them. So you may already have some soil analysis or a carbon audit done that will tick those boxes, in which case I would maybe wait and do your biodiversity audit in a couple of years' time, and then that'll last for 5 years from that point onwards. So the biodiversity audit for the whole farm plan only at this stage requires you to create a habitat map for all the land on your farm. And that includes the white space. So that might be any land that currently doesn't have a field number or a FID number allocated to it. So in the Lothians, our FID numbers are NT and then a series of 10 numbers. If you have any areas on your map that don't have a FID number and that are coloured white, so they don't have the blue line around them, but you know are your land. So it might be woodlands that you've never registered, or a small bit of rough grazing or something that you don't actually actively farm. These are still important to include in your biodiversity audit. However, you don't need to include any seasonal land that you only rent in. So that might be summer grazing or something. If you just rent it in on a seasonal basis, you don't need to include it. You have to select a habitat from the key that best describes the majority of land cover for each field and mark as individual features. And there's a key to help for that, and I'll be going through that in more detail. The key thing we've been told by SCRPD is not to worry about incurring penalties if you get the habitat type incorrect. The map is for your own use, and it can be amended in the future if it is found to be incorrect. So if you find yourself swithering between, oh, is it wetland or is it wet grassland, just have your best go at it. You're not going to get any penalties for having it incorrect. If you have a supply chain biodiversity audit already, so some schemes such as LEAF, for example, might have required you to prepare a biodiversity audit already. These will be eligible as long as it includes a map, and the map needs to meet the minimum standards. There are currently 3 ways to complete the biodiversity audit. The first one is the Rural Payments and Services habitat layer. So you can find that on Rural Payments. When you log into your own business, you'll see a tab that says map, and then it says location, and then there's a drop-down menu that says map, and you can open it there. There is some very detailed guidance on this online. It's not the easiest to use if you're not familiar with Rural Payments mapping program. You may have used it already to do some EFA mapping or to submit a land maintenance form, in which case you'll find it easier than if you've not used it at all. But I had to go with it today, and there is very detailed guidance that talks you through step by step. So as it says there, open map under locations header and use the edit habitats menu, and that will bring up all the various options. If you're not so au fait with the computer, the Real Payments website, you can do an annotated paper map. So that's, you can either download that from Real Payments and Services, or you can, if you've got an old IAX map or any other old map, you can use that, colour it in and annotate it yourself, as long as it complies with the key, which I'll come on to in a minute. You then need to upload that at IAX time next year. So when you're submitting your basic payment claim next year before the 15th of May, we're not quite sure how it will look yet on the Rural Payments website, but there will be a tab somewhere for you to upload supporting documents, and that'll be where you upload the map that you've created if you've done it in the paper form. If you do it on the rural payments and services habitat layer, it will automatically be sent to the department, so there's no need for you to upload anything to your IACS form as far as I'm aware. There might be a box to tick to say that you've done it on rural payments and services. We'll find that out as we get closer to IACS time next year. And finally, some of you may be aware of the NatureScot Biodiversity Audit app that's been out. There's been a number of farmers, I think around 200 farmers have been trialling that, and I've had a look at that and a wee go with that, and it does seem, again, quite a straightforward thing to do. It requires you to download the app and work your way through. You can select what field you're in, and it asks you a series of questions, which then allocates the habitat based on how you've answered. It's not available to download as yet, but it should be ready in time for IACS time next year, if not before. So we'll keep you updated on that. Keep an eye out on the FAS website and newsletters and things from your local advisors. Just have a keep an eye out on rural payments, and that'll be notified when that is available. I'm aware this might look quite small. I've tried to put all the habitats together on one screen, but we will be going through them all in more detail. This is the key that the Scottish Government have come up with to go alongside their habitats that they have decided with NatureScot are going to be the ones that you need to draw on your map. So we've got cropped land, grasslands, wetlands, woodlands, coastal, uplands and peatlands, other habitats, and linear habitats. So I'll go through them all in a little bit more detail now. So cropped land obviously is arable ground. So for many of you, this might be the only habitat that you've got, in which case you've got quite an easy job to map your farm. So that's a sort of a beigey coloured section there. On the Rural Payments website, it gives you more description on what they mean by these different habitats. So managed crops for nature are cultivated land managed to benefit biodiversity. So for anyone that's got a game crop or anything for crops sown with green manure, for example, to improve soil health, they would come under the category of crops managed for nature. And then the bottom one is a field margin. So that's the bottom picture that I've got there is a really wide field margin managed between two areas of arable crop. So you could have a go at mapping where that is. You might just have narrow margins of 2 meters, or you might have big ones like that one, which I think is about 20 meters wide. So they have all to be mapped on your habitat map. The grassland habitats, again, quite straightforward. Improved grassland, so this is productive grassland for grazing or forage that is subject to regular reseeding and inputs of fertilizer and lime. So that's on the picture on the bottom right-hand side there, that field in the front I would class as improved grassland. It's clearly productive grass, it's very green and lush, and you can tell that it's had fertilizer or lime at some point. There is more detailed habitat description available online as well for that. The semi-improved grassland is grassland with wider species diversity than improved grassland that is not part of your normal crop rotation, but does not meet the unimproved grassland definition. So that might be some of your rough grazing that doesn't regularly get fertilizer or lime, perhaps hasn't been reseeded for a long time. And the extra description says, cover of agricultural grass varieties such as ryegrass, timothy and clover will be less than 30% of the field. There may be some wildflower presence and may occur where unimproved grasslands have undergone some modification with, for example, the use of fertilizers or lime. And then unimproved grass, that's my picture on the left there. We can tell that's unimproved grasslands because it's highly unlikely to have ever had fertilizer or lime spread on it due to the topography. It's a very steep glacial formation, that field. And if you look at the front, you can see some blue flowers. It was Devil's Bit scabious was flowering away in that field. That's one that I surveyed a couple of months ago, and it was definitely classed as unimproved grassland. I would actually go as far as to call that species-rich grassland. The Scottish Government haven't split that out, but it certainly had lots of different flowering species in it. So it was clearly an unimproved grassland field. So we've now got wetland habitats. The photo on the left there shows you clearly it's a pond, which is the farmer has put in because he's interested in shooting. So it was just to prove the point that amenity, habitats and things that you've put in for your own enjoyment do also obviously benefit biodiversity. So whilst he's put it in for his shooting pastime, it's still an important habitat for biodiversity. So any sort of large areas of open water such as that are more than, you know, a couple of meters wide, I would consider mapping them. You get the polygon feature on the Rural Payments website that you can map them with or draw it onto your map by hand. So the description says any open water, these may be permanently wet, such as lochs, loch-ins and permanent ponds, or seasonally dry, such as waders, scrapes and seasonal ponds. That's a bit of a grey area. It's quite hard to map because wader scrapes are usually quite small, and if they're only seasonally wet, it is more tricky to map those. Wetland habitat there, so that's wetland that is too wet for livestock, such as swamp, reed beds, etc. So that's probably the habitat around the pond on the left photo there, where you really wouldn't put livestock in because they wouldn't be able to walk across it. So the description on the Scottish Government says generally of high conservation value, usually too wet for stock, fen, marsh, transition mire and reed bed. So that I would have thought for most people that will be a relatively small area of their farm. Wet marshy grassland is wet or marshy ground used for grazing with flowering species not dominated by soft rush. Can also apply to uncultivated areas in arable land. So wet or marshy ground with mostly tussocky forming grasses and rushes used for grazing, variety of flowering plants, sedges and rushes. These are not dominated by soft rush. And then we've got rush pasture, which is what I would class the photograph on the bottom right there. That is dominated by soft rush. And I think for most people that have any sort of rush grassland, this is the sort of thing that we're talking about. And I would class that as either semi-improved grassland or rush pasture, depending on how wet you think it is. It says it can be scattered rush or dense stands of rush with limited diversity of other plant species, often used by nesting waders. So anyone that has these sorts of habitats will know that you'll find snipe and things using this habitat. So it is of importance for wading birds. And finally, we've got water margins under this habitat. So it's an area of uncultivated land next to a ditch, burn, river, pond, loch, etc., and may be managed as grassland or may contain other habitats such as shrubs, trees or wetlands. So it doesn't need to be just a narrow strip alongside a ditch or whatever. It might be a really wide water margin alongside a big flowing river that might be wooded or something. And then we come on to the woodland habitat section. And as you can see, there's 5 shades of green there, which I find quite difficult to distinguish from on the map. So you might find if you're hand colouring the map and you don't have 5 different green pencils, you might find it useful to write in them CP for conifer plantation or whatever, for example. So I think we'll all be familiar with what a conifer plantation is. Anyone that's got one has probably been part of a scheme, or it's a very long-standing conifer woodland. So it's commercially planted stands of conifers, excluding mature natural Scots pine. Natural woodland is woodland dominated by native species such as Scots pine, birch, oak, ash, hazel and rowan. And it can include non-native trees like sycamore and beech, but they would not make up more than 50% of the woodland. So the photo on the left there, for example, I would call natural woodland. That's actually just taken at Bush Estate near where I work, and it's a very mature mixed woodland. There are a few sycamore and beech in there, but the majority, we've got oak and ash, there's horse chestnut and silver birch and a few Scots pine. So it's a really lovely natural woodland. The next category, mixed woodland, is either woodland with non-native species such as sycamore and beech, or a mix of native and non-native species. These woodlands may include up to 50% of non-native conifer species like larch and spruce. And then we've got wood pasture, so that's grassland interspersed with trees, including agroforestry, orchards and ancient wood pasture. So there might be people that have got parkland, for example, round about big old houses. Anyone with modern agroforestry schemes, anyone that's gone into the agroforestry schemes, that's what I would class as wood pasture. And then the final category there is scrub, which is areas dominated by native species such as willow, juniper, broom, gorse and blackthorn, but not rhododendron. And just to say, the photo at the bottom there is obviously a newly planted broadleaf woodland, but again, I would put that under the natural woodland category because it's woodland dominated by native species. Coastal habitats. I haven't actually surveyed any coastal habitats in the Lothians yet, so here's a nice photo that I took on my holidays to North Berwick, but it was just to show that some of the habitats you might have if you've got a coastal farm is the sort of ground heading down towards the beach there. So you might have salt marsh, sand dunes, grazed macar. If anyone's listening from any of the islands, you might have macar grasses, cropped macar and coastal heath. I'm not as familiar with those habitats myself, so I've got some of the description here. So salt marshes is intertidal land or merse ground, any vegetated intertidal land that is immersed by seawater during mean spring high tides, also known as merse ground. So you'll know if you've got those. Sand dunes, coastal sand hills and ridges, and dune slacks. So I'm guessing that's probably what I've got in my photograph there. Down towards the bottom is the sand dune area. Grazed macar and cropped macar. Obviously, if you're in one of those areas that has macar, you will know what that is. And coastal heath is a herb-rich form of heathland that occurs in exposed locations where the vegetation is strongly influenced by salt spray. So again, a very specific habitat type. Next, we've got upland and heathland habitats. Again, 4 shades of purple, which are quite hard to distinguish between. So again, I would maybe, if you're hand drawing these, try and use some sort of code, or if you're able to write the words in the map as well, so that you can distinguish between them all. So the upland mixed habitats, the description is land where it would be difficult to map individual upland habitats separately, to be used in an area with a complex mix of heather and or bog and or upland grassland. So my photo on the left there is the classic upland mixed habitat. Heath at the front, I would say, and then going up the hill, you can see some more open areas of grass. Towards the top of the hill on the left, there isn't any heathland at all. So you could have a go at separating them out if you really wanted, but I think to make life easy for yourself, I would call that upland mixed habitat, because that is a true mix of different habitats. Peatland, again, you will probably know if you've got peatland on your farm. So it's blanket bog or moorland bog or lowland raised bog. There's a bit more description on what they are. So blanket bog is often referred to as moorland bog, which is waterlogged ground on peat with a substrate of more than 50 centimetres deep, and it's dominated by sphagnum mosses and cotton grasses. Lowland raised bog, normally an individual distinct gently sloping dome of peat. It forms over thousands of years, and again dominated by bog mosses, heather species and cotton grasses. So there's two sort of subdivisions within that peatland one. Upland grassland areas above the hill dike or large unenclosed areas of hill. So my photo on the bottom right there, I would class as upland grassland. Grassland often referred to as rough grazing away from lowland in by. So in this example, that's clearly never been improved. It's up beyond the dike from the farm. And it hasn't been ploughed or reseeded. It's actually quite wet underfoot in places as well. And finally, the heath category, land dominated by heather species, can be dry or wet or lowland heath. So again, as I was saying, the photo on the left there, which is the purple heather, has clearly got a variety of heather in it. If you wanted to have a go at separating that out, if there's a clear line perhaps between the heather hill and the upland grassland, you could certainly separate out those habitats, or you could call them upland mixed habitats altogether. The other habitats that are listed that you are to include on your map, so if you've got any areas of dense bracken with no forage at the base, and any invasive non-native species such as rhododendron, Himalayan balsam and Japanese knotweed, so you've also to mark those on. Linear habitats are another one to include. So in this example, we've got the river on the left photograph there. That might be, if it was fenced off, you could call it your water margin, but this was part of a larger field. So I would call the field semi-improved grassland. In this example, it had been fertilized where they could, but obviously the steeper banks down to it are not. So you might want to separate it out as semi-improved grassland to the left of the photograph, and then draw a thicker line of water margin alongside the river where all the trees and things are. Obviously, of great importance to biodiversity. You'll get a whole load of species coming onto the farm where you've got water like that, and it's a really lovely habitat to try and maintain if you can. I've also included a photograph of what I call a good hedge. I'm sure we've all seen hedges around the countryside which become what I call a sort of lollipop hedge, where the hedge grows up, it's got a long base and then a lollipop of foliage at the top. That isn't really what we're aiming for in terms of biodiversity, because it's much better to have a denser hedge which is full of leaf structure all the way through. And the best way to get that to establish like that is to try and cut your hedge into an A shape. So you can see in that photograph there, as you look along the line of the hedge, it does sort of slope towards the top, and that just allows light to get to the branches at the bottom as well, which creates a thicker, more dense hedge, and it's better habitat for nesting birds. In this example as well, you can see, I mean, without being able to pick out what the species are, you can see that there's a variety of species within that hedge, which is also beneficial for biodiversity. It looks like it's mostly hawthorn and blackthorn, but going along, there's probably some rose and things as well. And if you can, it's worthwhile trying not to cut the full length of the hedge every year. In this example, it's obviously onto quite a rough grass field on the inside of the fence. You might get away with only cutting that every second year, and that just allows it to flower and fruit, which is obviously of benefit to biodiversity. If it's a roadside hedge, I appreciate that might not be possible, or it might not be possible in an arable field either for access reasons, but that's just an example of what is a really lovely hedge. It's well cut and maintained, and it's nice and thick. So you want to try and map all those as best you can. I often get asked, when is a hedge and when is a hedge a line of trees? It's a tricky one, and I would say that is clearly a hedge in that photograph. But if you get towards the more lollipop type scenario, where a lot of the growth has come away from the bottom of the hedge and there are significant gaps and it's maybe not cut annually, then it's probably erring towards line of trees. If you don't cut it with a hedge cutter and it's of significant height, then it's obviously a line of trees. The tricky one is where it's maybe alongside a wood or something, and you trim the sides but not the tops. So again, you're not going to get a penalty for getting it wrong. Have a go. If you cut it with a hedge cutter, I would say it's probably a hedge. If you don't, and it's very gappy or significant stretches with no hedge at all, you might want to consider calling it a line of trees. Just use your best judgment for that. And the final one to include is a dry stone dike, which is you might not think is great for biodiversity, but it can actually provide shelter for insects and reptiles as well. And especially if it's got a good grass margin alongside it, perhaps if it's alongside an arable field, it might have a nice grass margin as well, which just further adds to that habitat. Or if it's part of a rough grass field and it's maybe protected by a fence, then it also is of benefit to wildlife just by providing that extra bit of wildlife corridor. And finally, to include are the point habitats. So it's any general features such as native, non-native invasive species. You can just include a little dot with a label for those. So what I've been talking about tonight is the sort of minimum requirements for the whole farm plan biodiversity audit. You can do that yourself. It's relatively straightforward if you're able to print off a map or use the Rural Payments website. But for anyone that's interested in getting a more in detail biodiversity audit done, you can source some funding through the Farm Advisory Service Specialist Advice. So if you go to the FAS website, so www.fas.scot, underneath specialist advice, you'll find that there's a variety of specialist advice topics there, and it might be worthwhile, if you're interested in finding out more about the biodiversity on your farm and how to manage the habitats you've got, it might be worthwhile applying for that. The grant is for £1,600 and it goes directly to your consultant or advisor once they've completed the plan. So the good thing about this scheme is you don't need to pay for anything and then claim it back. It's all done for you. So you apply, you find out whether you're accepted or not, and then your consultant can get on and do the plan for you. If you don't have a consultant that you know of that is a specialist in biodiversity and conservation, on the FAS website, there's a list of specialist advisors who put that as their specialism, so you can choose one from there. So I just thought I'd flag that as well. The maps that are created from that can also be used for your whole farm plan. And that is me. So I will stop sharing and pass over to Fiona.
Thanks, Mary Jane, and thank you very much for a very good summary of where biodiversity audit fits within that wider whole farm plan. And it was great to be able to break down each section individually and reiterate that, the minimum requirement there is, it is something that farmers can do themselves. It's reasonably straightforward. So hopefully that's reassured anybody on the call who was maybe concerned about what a biodiversity audit entailed. Just before we move on, to Fiona, I'm just going to cover off a couple of questions which just relate, just nicely kind of tidy up the biodiversity audit package. So the first one, I'll actually just take it's around whether the Farm Advisory Service will do practical workshops on the sort of process of mapping biodiversity. So we have we tend to do workshops like that during the summer where it's a bit easier to actually recognise the habitats. So we have had some of those this summer there. Sometimes they're called recognising and mapping farmland habitats. Some of them maybe more use biodiversity audit in their title. And there is more of those planned for summer 2025 as well. So the sort of funding year for the Farm Advisory Service runs from the 1st of April to the 31st of March. So we've got more of those in the planning to cover some other locations in Scotland as well. And they have kind of practical activities out on farm, sort of a host farm with maps to try and help just to recognise the different habitats that exist. Mary Jane, another question we had was, can farmers use a mapping tool such as LandApp for their habitats?
Yes, so as long as it meets the requirements of what we've set out tonight. So the tricky thing is having the same categories that the Scottish Government have set out. So I'm not 100% sure on that, Mary, because I haven't used the Land app. Are you familiar with that one? Does it have similar categories?
I haven't used that one, no, but maybe it's something that we can take and look into and confirm. But yeah, I think there is that sort of, they're looking for kind of those categories, aren't they? So
yeah, we've asked that question, can we use existing maps and things? And if it's not got the same categories, then I think they are going to look for you to update it, which is unfortunate for anyone that has maybe had a biodiversity audit done, 2 or 3 years ago, and it's not the same key. But I suppose the benefit of that is if you've had one done already by somebody else on a different mapping program, you can probably quickly go through your map and identify what habitats they've said are wetland or whatever, and then fit it into the Scottish Government categories. That is a tricky one that I think you would need to look at what the key for the map that you have already says and whether you think that would fit the requirements.
but thank you very much. And just to cover kind of a couple of points, I know that there has been feedback through people using the app just around the grassland habitat categories, and I know some others are raising that as well, that actually there is quite a few grassland habitats, and maybe what you consider your grass to be, assigning it to some of the titles that have been given. It's a challenging thing to assign sort of names to categories that cover all the different farm types across Scotland. So it really is just, there's guidance available there for a bit more of a breakdown, and it really is just assigning the category as best you can. And just one point to note, there's some kind of comments coming in around the biodiversity audit funding that Mary Jane mentioned at the end. So a good point from a audience participant there that grant doesn't cover the VAT, so that is payable by the business.
Yep.
So yeah, very good point. But I would just like to point out, just because there's maybe a wee bit of confusion, what Mary Jane used that last slide to just effectively mention funding that is available for more in-depth information on biodiversity. So just to make sure we're distinguishing there between what is the minimum standard required for the whole farm plan on that map, and actually what is a much more detailed advisor-led package in the biodiversity audit. So it's not that the grant is £1,600 to do a map. That is actually a much more that sort of funding package gets an advisor out on to farm to assess the biodiversity, the condition it is, any improvements that could be made. So that is an entirely separate package. So just wanted to clarify there what that funding was for, and that it's not that there's a significant, it's not that money's being wasted by giving that significant amount of funding for people to create maps. So just wanted to clarify that. And any other questions, please keep firing them in, and we will have some other Q&A as well at the end. But for the moment, I'll hand over to Fiona.
So quickly, the kind of what and the why. So what, I think many of you will be familiar with. So IPM's that holistic approach, combining all those different methods to really minimise your agrochemical use. And it's tailored, this is kind of important, tailored to each individual farm. And it nests beautifully within regenerative approaches to farm systems. So many of the IPM approaches, like diversifying rotations, fit really nicely into a regenerative approach to farming anyway. And the aim is really reducing those health and environmental risks, but it's also helping you reduce costs. And it really is now widely accepted as being crucial to the sustainability of crop production. And that's why it's, within European, UK and Scottish policy. And that premise that we can reduce reliance on conventional pesticides and maintain your yields and profitability is really the sweet spot that we're aiming for with IPM. So there's where IPM sits within your whole farm plan. So it's one of those options. You'll see there on that slide that it's an annual review. So that idea that you're annually planning what measures you're going to take and how you're going to reduce risk on the farm. But many of you will be familiar with IPM plans already because they're part of the main crop assurance schemes. So 90% of the combinable crop, for example, already goes through an IPM plan. And you'll see there at the bottom of that slide, we've got, there's nearly 3,000 people for this year, 2024, have already completed an arable plan. And there are new plans now for grass and for horticulture. So they're new introductions. So they're becoming options for a broader range of people. And like I said, I'm really keen that we think about the why. So I think it aligns beautifully with sustainable and regenerative approaches. It's helping you eliminate overspends in pesticides. So by thinking about things, you avoid the extra sprays, the extra doses, the just in cases. It's also helping you by planning carefully. You're reducing that risk of outbreaks of pest, weeds and diseases that risk your yield. It's beneficial in terms of reducing reliance on pesticides, so you help reduce the risk of resistance. And we know that we're losing agrochemicals both through regulatory reasons, but also through resistance. So as a consequence, IPM can kind of gap fill as well. So where we've lost pesticide tools, other approaches, say varietal resistance, can help you bridge that gap. And then it also allows you to discuss and query advice that you get on farm. So by filling in a plan, it's a really good excuse and reason to sit and talk through the pesticide decisions that are being made and advised on your farm. And like I say, I think if I sort of take you below the bonnet a bit in terms of how the plan is designed. So the Scottish plan sits on the Plant Health Centre website, so bottom right there. And like I say, it's really a tool that can facilitate discussion. And the score is based on a 0 to 100. And the point is that you baseline yourself. This is not a score that somebody then looks and go, tut, tut, you only got 40%. The point is, if 40%'s fine, that's where you start, but you keep planning, you keep doing it every year. And the score was developed. So really, when you go to do the plan, it's 14 questions on how you plan, what you plan on the farm. And then it's got 8, what size is your farm, type socio-demographic questions. And that scoring system, because it's like comparing apples and cows and, pears, it was developed by stakeholders, so farmers' advisors, and it was how important they thought different measures were in terms of reducing risk. So it's not based on boffin advice like mine, it's based on farming appreciations of risk. So these are the questions that you'll see in the IPM plan. And you can see there the final weightings that these stakeholder groups came up with. So, continuous cereal production, rotation, kind of important, but you can see how they're graded. But then if you look at something like the preventative measures, so that's things like using break crops, barriers, seed hygiene, things that prevent the risk in the first place, that's judged to be really important and weights heavily in the score. But like I say, the point is not the score you get, it's about doing the exercise, doing this planning exercise. Interestingly, when you look at the arable area and the IPM scores that people get, the larger the unit, the better they score, is the trend. Of course, there are exceptions, but that's kind of interesting. And it may be that larger farms have more scope to diversify, have broader rotations, or it could be simple things like they have more time to leave and go for training and pick up, information. So that's just a point of discussion. You don't see that same trend for the grassland scores. So as I said, there's a new grassland IPM scoring tool. But you don't see that same link. So small farms score just as highly as big farms. But what we do see from looking through the data, and it's all anonymized, so we only ever see the information in generic terms, not individual farm plans. They come back to you individually. But if we look generically over the information, the people that score highest in their IPM plans are the ones that are most familiar with IPM. So they are the people coming to evening webinars to hear about it. And that's broadly the same for arable and for grassland farmers. And then the other interesting thing is, you know, we looked at what the differences are between people that score high or people that score low. And you can see there things like continuous cereals, rotations, varietal choices. The big difference between the high scorers and the low scorers is their pre-planning for those preventative measures. So they're thinking about their varieties, they're thinking about seed treatments, they're using break crops. And the other thing you see a big difference in are the planning factors there. So that's more your in-season stuff where you're thinking about using crop walking information, crop intelligence to adjust your spray plans as you go through the season. And the other thing that makes a slight difference there is attending discussion groups. So again, that goes back to how on top of the information you are and how, you know, you engage with this process. These are the grassland results for a similar exercise. So again, you see a very similar pattern there, that the people that score highest when they're doing IPM plans for grass are the ones that are doing those prevention, pre-planning type exercises. And again, that discussion group engagement has made a nice difference as well. So that awareness of IPM really helps to drive forward these improvements on the farm. And this little exercise was just done with farmers with Plant Health Centre funding to look at what influenced decisions to adjust your spray programme. So this is your in-season planning about timings and dose rates. And you can see there the green is the high influences. So agronomists make a big difference here. So that advice from agronomists is one of the key reasons that you would adjust things through the season. Obvious things there like weather, crop growth stage. People are thinking about pesticide resistance when they're adjusting and planning. They're often reacting to a lack of pesticide availability, changing plans. And then quite pleasingly, things like calendar date appear as a very low influence. So it's not great practice to just spray according to the calendar. And that, you know, comes out as a low influence. Interestingly, we often have this premise that farmers follow other farmers. And in fact, you're all thinking quite independently here. Other farmers are a relatively low influence in why you would change spray plans through the season. And this is just looking at information sources because, like I say, the awareness of IPM really helps drive improvements. So you can see there for arable farms, again, a lot of people turn to their agronomist, and then we've distinguished here between distribution agronomists and independents. So, for example, AICC members are in-house agronomists. So, you know, 50-50 there. Many arable farmers are relying on independent advice there. And they're picking out, you know, actual social media is quite interesting. So we know that it's actually surprisingly little read, but it's very little trusted. So people don't go there necessarily for a trusted source. And then when you look at the grassland, it's kind of similar, more reliance on distribution advice there. And as I've said before, a larger proportion are looking for information on IPM from discussion groups. So I think that's an interesting feature, but that gives you an idea of the places and sources that you can go to for IPM information. And then just to pick up on that thing about attending meetings, and again, it's about the win-wins in this for you. So that idea that once you've sought information on a pesticide or a technique, that you check in on what the new evidence is. And I always think pesticide resistance is a good example of why you need to keep checking in with what's the best things to be doing. And this is a chart that I often show, but it's showing, I mean, azoles are a really commonly used group of fungicides through your programs. But you can look back to 2001, where a full dose of prothioconazole would have given you between 80% and 100% control of septoria in wheat. And you can see that by 2023, you were down to barely 20%. So that decline meant that people have had to move on to more effective fungicides and adjust their programs. And if you hadn't checked in, you would clearly be well off the mark. And you can also see the introduction of a new azole there, which has higher efficacy. So yeah, just that ability to keep checking in your programs, keep checking with your agronomist what you're being advised, and just push forward those win-wins for you in really practical ways. I popped this one in because I think it's quite a nice example of, I referenced that you really need to be very farm and system specific with regenerative practices and with IPM. So here we have a couple of charts from SRUC trials in spring barley, just showing the yields there. And it's contrasting a minimum tilled situation with a ploughed situation. And you have untreated yields there, so slightly lower yielding in the minimum tilled scenario, which can be more challenging for spring barley. And then we've got the yellow and the purple there being your 1 or 2 fungicide spray programs. And it really illustrates that for many people, while a 2-spray program might be standard, it's very possible to maintain yield with a single spray where you've judged the risk in your scenario. And then the other bits we've got in there are a biological control and an elicitor product. And these are obviously newer alternatives to pesticides that can be used in programs that help to control your risk and are reducing that reliance on pesticides. So they fit within that idea of integrated pest management. But I would emphasize pesticides fit within this approach, but it is just that way of reducing your reliance on them and using the minimum effective that you really can. Now, I've sort of often when I'm talking about IPM with farmers, there are a couple of kind of perhaps more challenging questions that I get or negative perceptions. So sometimes the kind of perception that the uptake of IPM is too complex, it's all about small incremental improvements. I like incremental improvements, they can add up to quite a lot. But if it feels complex, like I say, it's not about your final score. It's just about using this planning exercise when you're doing an IPM plan. So do the easy bits. Almost everyone thinks about varietal resistance. You're all thinking about weather, tillage, sow date, and you're all looking at the crops. So there are easy, acceptable options within the more complex set of IPM mixes. And then sometimes the retort I get is that it's not economic to reduce inputs. And that may well be the case if you're really facing very high pest, weed or disease pressure. But even there are things you can do. By all means, keep inputs high, but use mixtures, use alternations, don't rely on any single one approach, and try and take out any marginal sprays, because these are the ones that are not particularly cost effective. And you can certainly move to the kind of lower risk pesticides and try and use lower risk options when you can. So there is wriggle room within the options, and it's very much about tailoring the approach to your farm, your situation, and indeed the fields within your farm. So really situation specific. So just a final slide here. I've headed it doing more with less. So, I mean, quite apart from the, many of you will be picking up more integrated practices anyway, but I mean, our hard reality is a diminishing number of products and modes of actions. The direction of travel for policy in many of our key markets is also clear. They're looking for this type of evidence. We know our knowledge is developing, but it is imperfect. So we're all learning together. And I would re-emphasize that point, that IPM, and this is the point of an IPM plan, it has to be specific to you and your situation. But by careful planning, using those preventative measures, you can really reduce your input costs and maintain your yields. So you're helping to manage those risks. Those incremental improvements do add up. So individually, they might sound small, but they can add up to, quite big improvements. and just take those opportunities and increased uptake of IPM practices. I think there are plenty of win-wins. I think many of you see plenty of win-wins in this. So baseline now, don't worry about the score. The point is that you're doing it, you're thinking, you're planning, and then you begin to review it annually. So that's my final slide. So I shall come out of screen sharing mode, and hopefully there's a few questions there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fiona. Yeah, useful to take us through the background involved in that. The background of that term IPM as well. That was very useful. So I will. There is just one question that I'll put yourself, Fiona, and also Mary Jane and myself can also kind of support with. But there's a question of people who, there'll obviously be people on the call who have like rougher grazings, untouched grazings, and actually what does IPM mean for them in a way? Do you want to add anything on that?
Yes, so mainly in the grassland scenario, it's much more about your weed control than it is. So that would be a key difference between that and the arable plan. So it would be things like using weed wipers, just being aware of what weeds you've got, using adjuvants to improve the efficacy of your herbicides. And again, that ability to plan ahead and try and prevent some of those weed risks. So it's tailored to what was felt by grass farmers to be important to them. So it's very, very different to the arable plan. So that's a good distinction. I'm glad to pull that out.
Super, thank you. And yeah, probably just from whole farm plan perspective specifically, the guidance is very clear that the businesses that sort of IPM plan would be accepted as a minimum requirement, they are focusing on the businesses that are using sprays. So there could be people out there who then, they aren't weed wiping, they aren't using those kind of things. And that's actually where the guidance in terms of the whole farm plan and what options will be applicable to you for your business, that you wouldn't actually need to worry about that integrated pest management plan, because as Fiona nicely explained there, it is more around where you are using sprays and things for your weed control. So very much just stressing that situation specific element. But likewise, there will be grassland farmers who it's maybe more in by grassland where they are using sprays. So the integrated pest management plan option does apply, and both the options, the plan itself and the questions that you get there are all available online. So it's via the Scottish Plant Health Centre, and realistically, if you Google Scottish Plant Health Centre Integrated Pest Management Plan, you'll land on the website, and it does nice and clearly, I would say, distinguish between if grass is your main crop and if arable is your main crop, and then you'll get those personalised questions from there. If there are any other questions, please fire them across. For the moment, I've got a question actually for Mary Jane. It is around, if I harrow in manure in the rotation, where does that kind of fit in the grassland category, as in relation to grass?
So for that one, I would look at the definitions that you get on the Rural Payments website. So you'll find them under the Whole Farm Plan Biodiversity section. And you're immediately going to rule out any sort of wet, marshy grassland rush pasture from the grassland section. So you're then looking at improved grassland or semi-improved grassland, and it's more about the makeup of the sward than how you're managing it per se. So improved grassland is productive grassland subject to regular reseeding and inputs of fertilizer and lime. So if it's getting lime and you're harrowing in manure and it's reseeded, then it's the improved grassland. If it's got a wider species diversity, so it says here, varieties such as ryegrass, timothy and clover will be less than 30% of the field. So if that's the case and you're harrowing in manure, I would call it semi-improved grassland. I think it's unlikely to be the unimproved grassland. I don't know if you remember, I had a slide with a very steep hill, which I said was on a glacial formation. That is what I would call unimproved, because there's no way that's ever had anything done to it just because of the topography. And I would actually class that as species rich. I think I said that the Scottish Government their categories don't go into as much detail as I would, as going out doing a biodiversity audit, giving advice, I'd give more detail around the type of unimproved grassland it is. But if you're harrowing in manure, I would say it's unlikely to be completely unimproved, it's probably in that semi-improved or improved category, depending on the makeup of the sward. So if you're able to give a bit of an assessment of what's in the sward, read the detailed habitat description on the Rural Payments website, and that'll hopefully guide you to what category. But as I said earlier as well, you're not going to get it wrong, you're not going to get in trouble for calling it improved or semi-improved. Just do your best assessment once you've read the detailed habitat description.
Super, thank you very much. So in the interest of time, we'll just round off there because I'm conscious we did say we'd be a 1 hour long webinar. So firstly, just to thank Mary Jane and Fiona for their contributions here this evening, and giving that sort of overview of the two elements of the whole farm plan, and I think giving people the resources and information that they need to go and actually conduct these elements of the whole farm plan. So the final webinar in this series will be on the animal health and welfare plans. So another kind of individual element of the plan. So that one is on Tuesday, the 3rd of December. And you can book a place on that via the Farm Advisory Service website, and there's an events section in almost the top right when you log on, and you'll be able to access that there. There is also the option if you're requiring sort of further support after this, you can access support via the Farm Advisory Service helpline, and that's 30 minutes of advice. So, if you've come across outstanding queries, you can access those there. And finally, we would love to hear your feedback about tonight's webinar. There is a feedback form which you will be sent round, and I'll also pop the link into the chat here as well. So if everybody who's joined tonight could please complete that survey. We pay very close attention to the feedback we receive, so please tell us what you liked, what we could have done better, and that'll be taken on board. But for the moment, I'd just like to thank everybody for their contributions and wish you all a good evening.